Hello, everyone. Local Food Systems and Small Farms Educator Zach Grant here. Welcome you back once again to the 2018 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series, hosted by the University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems and Small Farm team. We are moving our way towards the end of the series, and we really appreciate you joining us once again for these webinars. We're going to do our best to begin and end within the space of this lunch hour, which is a very tight delivery period for our educators. So please understand, if you have questions, try to put them in the text box to the left during the presentation. I will do my best to make sure our presenters answer them as time allows or provide you with links if at all possible. I have posted call-in information in the chat box if you continue to have audio or video issues. Additionally, you should have received the protected slide set for today's webinar in one of my last two emails. There is a chance that if you have limited internet bandwidth, you will have either audio or slide visual problems. Sometimes audio problems might occur if you do not have the correct audio device enabled or you do not have an audio source connected. Try right-clicking on your speaker icon in the bottom toolbar to see what playback device you have connected. As a reminder, this presentation is being recorded, and I will email a link to the archived presentation as soon as possible after this webinar concludes. So, if we run over on time and you need to leave early, you will receive an email with a link to the recorded webinar. There will also be a link for a very short online evaluation for this presentation, and as always, we very much appreciate your feedback for future webinars and potential research projects. This week's presentation is from Doug Gucker. Doug is my local food systems and small farm extension educator counterpart in DeWitt, Macon, Piatt counties, and he is housed in Decatur, Illinois. His work primarily focuses in the areas of farm management, soil health, nutrient management, and integrated pest management and grazing. Doug's other interests include agricultural entrepreneurship, beekeeping, cover crops, native prairie restoration, water quality with regard to agriculture, as well as urban farming and local foods, which is really near and dear to my heart. His diverse previous work experiences include agricultural technical service representative, small Illinois grain and livestock farmer, and work as a natural resource conservation agronomist. Doug has a bachelor's degree in biology and agronomy and a master's degree in agronomy. Most of our YouTube videos and webinars related to bees have actually been produced and presented by Doug. Today, he is going to take us on a slightly different journey into the world of native bee pollinators. Take it away, Doug.
Thank you, Zach, and good day to everyone. We're going to talk about native pollinators today, native bees, as well as we have a few others that everyone should be aware of as well. So, part of our problem and part of the great interest over the past 10 years in native pollinators is the fact that we have this system of moving European honeybees around for pollination services. And while this system worked quite well for over 100 years, with the advent of the varroa mite and the fact that more of our production areas are getting centralized in different areas of the country, requiring longer travel times for bees strapped down in hives on the back of a flatbed truck. Imagine that if you're trying to have a comfortable vacation trip. So they're stressed, and because of that, we're seeing high losses of honeybee colonies. And so this is just to point out the fact that over here we can see the fact that we have honeybee colony losses that are unsustainable. But with all that in mind, what we need to remember is that we've got over 4,000 different species of native bees alone in North America, and here in Illinois, just to give you an example, we have several hundred species. So we've got a lot of native bees, let alone other native pollinators that can do the job for us. The other thing that research out of Cornell and Penn State have shown, particularly in orchards, is that 250 female mason bees can do the same amount of work as 15,000 European honeybees. That's a 60-fold difference. So these are extreme. They may be small in numbers, but they're extremely efficient in what they do. The other thing we need to remember is that our native pollinators are adapted to the area where we are. So here in the Midwest, where we have a lot of cold, wet, damp spring weather, which really our native honeybee, our European honeybees hate, you will see our little native pollinators out there working on snowbells and other things when it's 40 degrees. So they're amazing animals. The other thing is, with this great diversity of native pollinators, they can survive the stress of some kind of a disease or pest outbreak much better than just a single species source of pollinating. So they're really a wonderful thing, a resource that we need to take better advantage of. So here in Illinois, you can get this nifty poster from the Illinois Department of Natural Resources that shows our most common native bees. It also talks about habitat and what you can do to encourage them more in Illinois and on your farm or your areas. But besides native bees, something we need to remember is we have lots of other insects and animals that do pollinating. Ants. Ants feed on, of course, nectar, but they also feed on pollen in some flower types, so they can be one. The soldier beetle, they are great pollinators. We've got the tachinid fly and the seraph fly. These are two flies here in Illinois that if you watch pollinating plants, you'll see them on. In the evenings, moths come out and you'll see them on things that are in bloom, if the blooms are open at night, as well as our butterflies and, of course, hummingbirds. So we have a variety of different animal types that are also native pollinators. So this is a research paper that came out in 2014. There were 12 different researchers that took part in this particular project from all over the world. 3 were from the United States. And their reason for addressing for this paper was the fact that we're beginning to notice in crops that require pollination to produce a product for yield. So this is some of our vegetables as well as fruits, that even though we are improving varieties and should be improving yield, we're seeing that yields are kind of stabilizing and not growing at a rate that we would expect. And so as they trace this back, what it's coming to is the fact that we're showing a decline in native pollinators because we have such a reliance on our European honeybee. So once again, this idea that we're converting natural areas to agricultural areas, we're doing away with the sites that are friendly to native pollinators for them to survive, and our over-reliance on one species to provide pollination services. The other thing that came out of this is the fact that if we just apply a single practice, such as a flower strip swath close to a 10-acre field, the abundance of native pollinators increases by 76%. So it doesn't take a whole lot to make a change in the number of pollinators, native pollinators we have on your farm or in your area. The other thing we need to remember is that our native pollinators, for the most part, aren't strong or long distance flyers. And so we need to have some type of a native pollinator practice that's within 100 meters, 300 plus feet of the edge of the field. And so if we keep these types of things in mind, we can come up with some practices that we can use on our farms that will be very work out very well and help us become sustainable and not reliant on just the European honeybee for our pollination practices. Another thing is over here on the left side, this graphic with the two circles. This is a project on blueberries up in New Jersey. And the left circles, a set of circles, that was a 300-meter radius. So that was, we're talking 1,000 feet. And as you can see, the farther we move out, the activity of the native bees declines. And our second circle then moves from that 300 meters out to 1,500 meters. And as you can see, once we move beyond 300 meters, there isn't much of a decline, because at that point we're strictly reliant on our strong native pollinator flyers, such as our bumblebees, which are strong flyers and can fly up to a mile or more. So once again, this idea is the closer we keep it, the more diversity we'll have. And finally, something of interest that came out of this paper, this research article, was the fact that we can make a difference. The fact that if we plant a flower swath of native forbs close to our field, and you can see a close-up of that picture there with an assortment of different flowers and flower types, that within 4 years, your payback for taking that area out of production is more than compensated by the improvement you get in the yield of the product that you're getting out of your production field that you have left. And so this is very important, that we need to remember that putting a swath into a native pollinator habitat doesn't mean that you're taking land out of production and it's costing you money. It may cost you money in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to provide you with additional sources, additional income that you wouldn't normally have. So a little bit about our solitary bee. Most of our native bees are solitary bees. In other words, they lay an egg, or they lay several eggs, but they lay an egg on top of a ball of pollen. That's the food source when the egg hatches. These bees do not survive the winter. So their survival mechanism is the fact that the egg survives the winter, hatches in the spring. When the temperature is conducive, the larvae feeds on the pollen ball. It pupates, turns into a bee. The bee will live anywhere from a few weeks to over a month or more, and then lays eggs, and the cycle continues. So this is what we're looking at, and what's important to know when we're talking about our solitary bees. And actually, it has to do with a great number of our native pollinators outside of the ranks of bees. So what can you do on your farm? Well, the first thing is take a survey. Figure out what you have. Do you already have some existing bee pollinator habitat? Do you even know what plants are flowering at what times of the year on your property? This can be very important. I know when I first did this years ago, when I first started keeping honeybees, I was quite surprised to find out that most of my plants flowered between June and August, which is when we're outside and when we want to see pretty things flowering. But the reality is that if we want to have pollinators, native pollinators, any type of pollinators, we need something from the beginning of spring to the first killing frost of the year at blooming, if we possibly can. So take a look, see what's out there and what's flowering. The other thing is that do we have some nesting sites, potential nesting sites or current nesting sites for these native pollinators? So do we have any bare untilled soil areas or partially bare untilled soil areas? This is what our ground nesters like. Any undisturbed area could be a potential forage or nesting site for our native pollinators, our native bees. Do we have any dead trees or snags? Trees with dead branches on them, because this is where some of our tunnel boring beetles will go. These tunnels then become nesting sites for some of our bees. And do we have any pith-centered shrubs, roses, brambles, sumac? That's just to name a few. These are great sites for those types of insects as well. Okay, so you take that survey, and so that's basically just going out and observing what you have and making a note of it. So then, this next step is, how can you adapt what you already have? This idea of fence rows and windbreaks, these can be just already natural existing things that you have that can be either improved upon, to make an even better site or habitat for our beneficial insects as well as our native pollinators. The other idea is something in your cropping system. Are you growing some crops, and the fact that could you allow a few of them to bolt or to flower before you till them under? Just once again, it could provide additional flower source during a time of the year when you may be deficient in not having many things flowering at that time. Other thing is that when you're figuring out your planting dates of your crops and things, can you also figure it out so that your flowering dates begin to stagger as well, so you get this prolonging of the flowering period? And then a last thing to keep in mind is rotating crops. As I mentioned, some of our native pollinators, and particularly our small bees and flies, they don't fly very far. In fact, some of them only fly tens of yards period, a tens of yard radius of where they're born, to get all of their food needs and to lay their eggs. And so squash is one example. The squash bee, which is one of our native bees, it will only fly 50 yards. Well, if you move your squash field to the opposite side of the farm and it's eighth of a mile away, it may take a couple of years before the squash bees ever find that squash field. So the idea is if you can set up a systematic rotation so that your pollinators follow your rotation around the farm, this works out for the best. And after you've taken that survey and you've figured out that you have nesting sites and foraging plants, just keeping those. And of course, reduce pesticide use. So that's what the pictures are all about here. This idea that willows are one of our early spring flowering plants. Over on the right side, we've got the goldenrod here in the Midwest, which is one of our latest flowering plants. And then the idea of a fence row with some brambles growing on it, providing some habitat for forage as well as possible nesting sites for certain bee types. So, keeping that in mind, how do we provide pollinator habitat? Well, we need to, first of all, how can we increase the availability of foraging habitat? So this is variety of plants, variety of blooming periods, variety of flower styles. So the next thing is creating nesting sites, suitable ground conditions. If we don't have any dead trees or crags, the idea is, can we put up some nesting materials for the native bees and pollinators that like this type of habitat? Can we provide them with the nesting materials? These are things we can do. The other thing, once again, this idea of reducing the use of pesticides. Insecticides kill pollinating insects and beneficials, especially if we use them nearby areas where we'd like to have them and our habitat sites. And herbicides can kill our foraging plants for our native pollinators. All things we need to consider when we're looking at this whole systems approach to what we're doing on our farm. So, to enhance what we already have or to provide it is if we've got existing habitat sites, these untilled areas on the farms, and this can be lots or areas around buildings that on your farm. They can be woodlots, they can be stream banks, they can be utility easements, they can be conservation areas or buffers. Just keep your mind open to the variety of different things because they can all provide habitat or forage sites for our native pollinators. But while we do that, not everything that is green is good. So we need to manage our noxious weeds, invasive plant species, because they can rapidly take something that is a pollinator site and turn it into something that is not useful for anything or anyone. So we need to keep that in mind, that not everything is green, and we have to manage these sites just like we manage our cropping areas as well. Our peripheral areas, the field edge, the fence rows, if you're lucky enough to have hedgerows, even your roadsides, these can all be areas. Where you can provide either foraging or nesting areas, or at least a protective area for pollinators and beneficial insects to move in. And so these are all important areas. And so as I try to tell people in my area is that your fence row, your roadside shouldn't look like hole number 5 on the golf course. You only need to mow it once a year to keep the junk, the junk trees and different plants that birds like to leave as presents when they roost in those areas. We only need to mow once a year, and we can even schedule that mowing so we can do it towards the end of the season after a frost, so we're really not disturbing our beneficials at all, and we don't end up having something that a road commissioner or nearby neighbors consider to be a nuisance. So once again, all these areas can be used that you're not using right now. So here's just kind of an example of the field is actually over on the far left of the picture. There's kind of a farm lane beside it. And then we've got this area of forbs and grass and a few shrubs, which is a great kind of a pollinator habitat. The farm lane there, that path, that is great for rodent control because that gives a zone for particularly our raptors to come in so that we don't. These areas can be areas where rodents come into, but we also this can also be a way that we provide a way to keep those naturally under control. And I use those on my own place, and it works quite well. As far as to provide or enhance what you already have, you can if you already have a beneficial insect planting, and some of our more progressive, sustainable farmers are doing this and putting these areas out in their plantings, these can also provide great forage for our pollinators as well. And if they aren't, with just a little bit of thought, we can add some pollinator-friendly plants into these areas, and all of a sudden we've got something that's great not only for our beneficials, but it's also great for our pollinators, and it's a win-win for everything. If you've got some poor areas of land, like a dry, sandy knob or a ditch bank or a stream bank. These can all be areas that can provide nesting or foraging sites. Those dry hilltops, they're great for nesting sites for some of our bees. And we can also plant some of our adapted drouthy forbs in those areas, and they can also provide a foraging source as well, where they may not be the best place to grow in a particular crop. For orchards or perennial crop areas, brambles, berries, those types of things, there's the thought that our alleyways, and this is something that is beginning to catch on finally, planting it to our Dutch clovers or white clover. It's something that blooms profusely throughout the year, and if we mow it, it'll bloom again. Now, while this is a single species, which isn't perfect, it still at least allows a pollen and nectar source beyond what is normally available in that orchard or berry patch. So once again, another easy way we can do something that can provide habitat or forage for our native pollinator. And the other thing is flower gardens on the farm. Be intentional if you've got a flower garden and start expanding that range of flowers and flowering periods and flowering types that are in that garden, because this can be a backup reserve for pollinators when everything else is beginning to fail. Or it can be that point, that place they go to if something does fail. So, habitat characteristics. I mentioned before this idea of short distances are better. So generally speaking, we want it less than or equal to a half mile away. Shorter is better. The size of the habitat. It would be ideal if we could devote 30% of the farm or the area nearby where we're farming to some type of a native pollinator habitat. The reality is, as much as you can do is great. So anything you do is going to improve the number of native pollinators that begin to come and are attracted and stay at your farm. So anything is better than nothing. So that is the reality. But also be creative. And the idea that alleyways can be planted to flowering things like Dutch white clover and some other things, so that we can make some use of sites that we previously didn't think we could. Keep that in mind. The other idea is if we don't have trees or we don't have the crags, this idea of nesting blocks. If you've got a farm that seasonally floods, and that's not that unusual, well, how about the idea of introducing one of our native plants into that area that's adapted to this seasonal flooding? It's going to bloom in some time, and if it works well and doesn't become invasive, this can be a great win for you and not just another area of the farm that has to be mowed because you have to mow it. Windbreaks. These can be a great food source. People don't realize that right now here in central Illinois, even though it's only 30 degrees today, our maple trees have been blooming for the past week. This is another we don't think of trees as a pollen source, but this is one of the most important springtime pollen sources for our native pollinators. That's followed by the willows here here in central Illinois. That's then followed by the oaks, hard maples, hickories, walnuts. All these are then progressing as we get into May. And then we begin to get, and as well as some of our forbs begin to come online and our flowers. But trees are especially important early in the year, so we need to remember that as well. And that whole idea that nobody likes a dead branch, but if you've got an old dead tree out away from your house or buildings and it's not causing any problem, this could be a nesting site for native pollinators. Here we've got this idea that you can leave a roadside unmowed for a period of time and then come in and mow it. But in the meantime, it provides a great habitat for beneficials and native pollinators. The other thing is occasional mowing is necessary because otherwise these open areas will tend to become invaded by shrubby plants. Establishing these forage sites, the key thing we have to remember is for these insects, our native bees, or any of the rest of native pollinators, pollen is critical for them to reproduce. For some of them, it is how their young feed. For others, it's one of their protein sources, just so that they sustain their colonies on through the rest of the year. Idea closer to the nest is better. We want a variety, as I keep stressing, not only of flowers, but flower types, because different, particularly of our native bees, different bees go to different flower types. And so this is all very important. And then the idea of blooming succession. If we can have it from the very earliest of spring to as late in the fall as we can, this is just wonderful, not only for our pollinators, but for the beneficials. I talk a lot about native plants, and the reason I talk about them is they're adapted. They're used to growing in whatever conditions we have in that area, and they're used to drought and wet cycles and whatever has occurred over the past hundreds of years in our particular area. So take some time and take a look at those abandoned areas like the old railroad tracks, if you can find some of those nearby, and things like this, or some of our native, if you have any native plantings nearby. And this will give you an idea of what grows in the wet areas, what grows in the dry areas, what grows at what time, so that you don't just kind of pick and choose from a catalog and you sometimes get disappointed. Also important, choose plants, if you're going to establish a site, that don't require that you have to spend a lot of time tending to them. And finally, non-invasive plants. We don't want something that's going to take over the farm and the world to provide a nectar source and a pollen source. So, forage plant diversity. If we want greater pollinator diversity, we need greater plant diversity. And so while I've talked about the white clover, that's swell, but if we can have other sources as well to help, if we've got our alleyways planted to white clover, but if we have other areas with other flower types that are not that far away, we can still provide that pollinator diversity while still also having this area of pollen that's available for a variety of some of our other pollinators. This idea of range of flower shapes, I've already mentioned that. It helps attract a wider variety, particularly of our native bees. We don't want gaps in our bloom period because this can then cause gaps in the pollinator life cycle and may in fact cause there to be some deficiencies in pollinators, particularly when you may need them. And the idea is, once again, it's not just flowers. Look at your shrubs, look at your trees. These are great sources of pollen, particularly at the end of the year and the beginning of the year, when so many of our flowers, really, we don't have many flower choices. And the idea, spring to fall. That's what we want to keep looking at. It's the idea of providing variety and providing length. So we want to, even though we want to avoid our invasive plants, here you'll notice up on the right-hand corner, that is our good friend bush honeysuckle. Yes, it has a beautiful flower. It has beautiful red berries. And it is a plant that is trying to take over the woodlands of central Illinois right now. I can't talk about other parts, but it is a terribly invasive plant and is being spread rapidly by birds throughout the area. This is one plant that you do not want because one plant within a period of 4 years becomes a colony of plants. So we don't want that. And we don't want them spreading, and we don't want your neighbor to say you were the cause of a problem. So, and they just cause more maintenance. They just cause, so if you control it when it's small, however you decide to do it, by pulling or herbicide or continuous or frequent mowing, whatever it is, take care of it before it becomes a big problem. The other thing is right plant for the right location. Sun-loving plants need sun. Wet plants do well in wet areas. Droughty plants do well in dry areas. Pay attention to this. This is once again this idea. See where the natives are growing in what places, so that'll give you an idea of what you should plant. The other idea is how tall will it grow. As you see, in this lower picture, we've got this tall windbreak. If that's what the person wanted, that's wonderful. But if they thought they were going to have something that was only going to be 8 feet tall and is now approaching 25 feet tall and shading a lot more of their crop area than they wanted, then they may be very unhappy. The other thing to remember when we plant these tree rows, you can see there's a line of shrubs that are growing down here, along the edge of this tree line. If that was the original intent, that's wonderful. But if their original intent was to have a forb and shrub strip that was going to be an area of forage for the pollinators and a beneficial insect habitat, it's now being overrun by the shrubs and they're losing that habitat effect. And so once again, this idea that we may have to do some occasional maintenance, which may include selective mowing of these areas. The other thing we need to look at is how easy is it to get established? Are you going to have to water these things? If you're going to have to water these things and you don't have water nearby or the time to water them, that's not a good choice. Bunch grasses, I've been talking a lot about flowers, but bunch grasses, once again, are loved by butterflies because they're resting areas for butterflies. They can also be part of this protective area or linear corridor for roadsides because they provide a protective area that our beneficials and pollinators can travel in without being captured by birds and other predators. So, if you're going to establish a habitat, if it's a large area, my recommendation would be seeding. First of all, it's quicker and cheaper than using transplants. However, if you have a small area, particularly if we're talking like areas around your home or farm where you're wanting to increase the number of blooming plants, then transplants might be a very good way to go because once again, you've got access to water, you can keep them watered and you make sure they can survive and thrive. Site preparation, weed-free. Whatever we start with, whether it's a seeding or transplants, we want the area into which it's going to be weed-free. Why? It reduces that competition to that young plant, which in turn increases its chances of survivability. And in the case of seeding, you get a thicker, quicker stand. How can we do that? We can do it with tillage. We can do it with mulches, particularly with transplants. In fact, I would encourage that with transplants, just so you don't have to go back and do weeding. We can do it with mowing, but once again, that's careful mowing, so that we aren't damaging, we are not having moweritis damage to the plants we're trying to protect and encourage. And herbicides can be used, but once again, these are selective herbicides and have to be used with caution and diligence if they're going to be used. Seeding, always we need a smooth, firm seed bed because these seeds typically are small. We do have some large seeds, but a lot of these seeds are very small, fine seeds. So we need this smooth, firm seed bed. Good seed to soil contact is what we need. We need to use seed from varieties adapted to our area, or at least in our same latitude. I had experience. I once started a prairie with seed I got from a local seedsman. I later found out the seed came from South Dakota. Prairie planting, that particular prairie planting just never ever worked out well because these plants were adapted to a different photo period. They never grew as tall, they never were as robust, they just never were able to compete. So, if you're going to buy seed, buy it from the same latitude if at all possible, or if you're buying transplants, buy transplants. They're coming from nurseries in your in the same regional area, so you know they're adapted to where you're going to be planting them. Early fall and dormant seeding are best for our native or perennial seeds. Spring seeding is best for grasses, but I want to tell you that grasses over time will tend to outcompete forbs or native wildflowers or perennial flowers. So I wouldn't worry about that, about seeding grasses in the fall. If it's part of a mix that you're getting, a pollinator mix that you're getting. Don't worry about it because eventually you're going to have to mow that down so that your forbs can be rejuvenated. Our methods for seeding are either a native seed drill or a conventional drill. If you get debearded seed, a conventional drill works fine. If you don't, you're going to have to use a native seed, but your seedsmen, work with them, they'll tell you this. And it can be as simple as just broadcasting them, and if you do that, then you just need to roll it or use a cultipacker so that seed is pressed into the surface of the soil. Transplants, once again, weed-free area. I can't stress that enough. And if we can keep that area at least within a 1 foot radius of that, where that plant stem is planted, that plant will establish and grow so much quicker than if it's competing with grass and other vegetation right up to its plant stem. As far as plant spacings, this is just general, but our herbaceous plants typically 2 to 3 feet. Our woody shrubs and trees, typically we're on somewhere between 4 to 10 foot spacings, sometimes it's 12 to 16, but once again, just pay attention to what you're getting. The other thing is, avoid planting in droughty periods if you have transplants. Don't plant if you're going to be planting in the spring of the year, plant in the early spring when we have a greater tendency for our spring rains, particularly here in the Midwest. As we get into June, later part of May and into June, we tend to get drier or longer periods of dry weather. And so this then puts a lot of stress on a newly planted transplant. Also remember, a transplant is going to need roughly 1 inch of water per week, provided either by rainfall or irrigation if it's going to survive that first year. Additionally, think about the cost, and I would recommend it, of putting down a plant guard or tree guard, particularly if you're putting out shrubs or trees. Because yes, it's another several dollars per plant. But in the winter time, rabbits and voles, and later on deer as they get bigger, if you have deer in the area, they can just raise havoc on your planting if you don't do this. And that's what this picture is. It's a picture of rabbit and vole damage on a viburnum. So, now then, let's get on to the ongoing management you're going to need. So, we're going to we need to mark these newly planted areas. There's nothing more sickening to mow off a new planting of trees, windbreak planting, because you forgot to mark it with flags and you just mowed it off. Keep the weeds under control. Mulches are great. We have some herbicides, but they are very few and very expensive. And the idea of selective mowing. If you see weeds coming in, go in there and mow it. You may need to mow high to protect what's underneath, but don't let whatever it is go to seed. Protect what you have there. And then the periodic mowing, the periodic maintenance, the occasional mowing or burning to rejuvenate native plantings, and the removal of weedy or invasive species. This picture shows Canada thistle that's rapidly overtaking a Lespedeza, a vetch planting. This should have been taken care of much sooner than it has been. A flower garden around the farmstead or your home, excellent pollen and nectar source for native pollinators and beneficial insects. But the idea is that we want good nectar pollen suppliers. So our older flower varieties tend to fit this better, whether they're annuals or perennials. And that's why we talk a lot about native flowers. Herbs are excellent pollen and nectar suppliers. And then this whole idea when you're planting your flower garden that you get this long season of blooming, so that once again it can be just another supplemental site for your native pollinators. Cover crops, really popular. We can use those as a source of pollen for our native pollinators. They're quick, they're easy, they come in, they work really well. We can have annual short-term cover crops, or we can have this idea of a perennial cover crop planting the alleyways and our orchards or brambles that I've already talked about. But they also have additional benefits because they can fight erosion in alleyways. They can provide some nitrogen fixation, as people know. Well, the idea here is that we just want to give priority to pollen and nectar-rich species. So keep that in mind. And there's a lot of, and whether it's a cool season or a warm season where you're trying to grow this, particularly for some type of an annual planting, and not to plant a cover that's related to a crop that you've got out in a field. Don't do that. It just brings in more problems. Habitat limitation, annual cover crops, it's feast and famine. So you still have to have that permanent forage source nearby on your farm as a backup for your native pollinators to go to. But it can be extremely useful in helping to beef up the pollinators over a short period of time ahead of another crop. If you use crop insurance on something on your farm, just be aware that you have to follow certain rules ahead of crop insured crops. Maintenance, minimize pesticide. Don't spray insecticides in a cover crop you're using as a pollen source for pollinators because you're going to kill them. The other thing is try to terminate them at the end of the blooming period for that particular pollinator. Cuts down on mortality of our native pollinators that might be in there, and also do it before seed set because otherwise you're going to have the cover crop that keeps on giving. And as I mentioned before, the idea of a permanent forage habitat, once again, before seed set, that is a real issue. It's a no-no. Maintenance, wait a minute, come on now. There we go. Ground nesting sites, we can provide those once again, but they need to be relatively close, less than a half mile, that's preferred. 70% of our native bees nest in the ground. So it's this idea of a well-drained, bare to partially bare soils with sun exposure.
just kind of take a look. A lot of times this can be at the edge of a tree line where the grass and the trees kind of fight it out. We get the kind of sparse, partial shade, partial sun. Bees like those kinds of areas as well, or the dry knobs, those types, or ditch banks. All these can be areas where bees like to be, and disturbed soils. What they don't like is an intensively managed pasture, because the livestock will walk and trample them down. Also, these native areas might seem like a great place to run your four-wheelers, but if you run your four-wheelers through your native plantings, you aren't going to have beneficial insects or your native pollinators, because they don't want to be roadkill. Lastly, if we have large areas of plastic or fabric mulches, this will then impede the number of ground nesting sites we have available. So just, if we can, try to keep the soil open. Periodic burnings or haying in some areas can also help remove thatch, all very important. Materials, we can provide snags, we can put up nesting blocks. All this is really great. We can also put out bundles of natural stems. We can use paper straws and put them in PVC tubes with a closed end. These can all be artificial nesting sites that we can use or help to improve nesting sites on our farms. We've got a variety of different shrubs here locally in Illinois: sumac, our prairie rose, our wild brambles, cup plant, which is a native flower, as well as snowberry, ironweed. These can all be some of the things that our native bees use as nesting sites. Nesting site tunnels, once again, if we're going to use them, south-facing exposure is what they like. They like to face the sun. 4 feet off the ground helps keep down on predation as well as flooding. And something that has a little overhang or protection from the midday heat is also what they like. So tree trunks, south-facing tree trunks, buildings with an overhang, all of these things will work well. Paper straws, we can use these, work out extremely well, and then we can take the straws, put them in a protected area such as a refrigerator or ventilated container, bring them out in the spring, and they do great as far as introducing native bees back in again and greatly improving their survivability. These are all things we can do. Bumblebee nesting. Bumblebees love rodent holes. Abandoned rodent burrows and nests. They love these areas for their nesting areas. And so we can create these sites by kind of a 5-foot wide swath of tall grass and forbs together, because rodents like to make their nests or burrow at the base of these clumps of grass. And then in turn, this will become a site later for bumblebees. Also, this idea of a row of shrubs and forbs. These are also great areas for rodents and bumblebees. But once again, this idea of a lane or closely mowed area near this spot, because this then becomes a hunting zone for predators, particularly our winged raptors. This becomes a great killing area, hunting zone for them. The Xerces Society, no matter where you are in the United States, they have resources for every region in the United States. They have advice on what plants to put out, what is adapted for your area, what practices work best in your area. This organization has been working for over a decade. They put on training. It's a fantastic resource for native bees and native pollinators. So just go there. You can find a great, at least starting list of plants that you can start including into your landscape. And from there, you can expand it depending on what you see nearby in your area. And finally, questions. And I still have a mic.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Doug, and we will go back in and edit the video with the technical difficulties, but I think we actually were still able to squeeze all of it in within the hour. So for those of you who do need to hop off the call, we understand, but we're going to go ahead and ask a series of questions that I curated during the presentation. So those of you who did ask your question, if you want to stay on for some additional conversation to get that question answered, that'd be appreciated. Otherwise, it will be captured in the recording and you can refer back to it later. So we'll go ahead and go in the order of the questions that were asked, and some of them may have been answered in subsequent slides, but let's just go ahead and go over them. So the first question that came up, Doug, was how do you manage for noxious weeds without herbicides? And I think this kind of got to the point before you were talking about site establishment for pollinator strips, but do you want to just sort of rehash that?
This is the idea. This is the idea of selective mowing, or if you're not going to use herbicides, and I understand that, but be aware we can be very selective with our herbicides. Nature Society has an applicator that's literally a dauber, but if you're not going to use it or you're organic, mowing. Set that mower low, mow off the shrub, mow off the weed, and mow frequently. And you will wear out those plant reserves and it'll die back, and then you can reclaim that area again, or the area will naturally reclaim itself.
And then the other part to that, because that question could also be interpreted as you need herbicides to manage noxious weeds. So in that case, choosing the correct herbicide, making sure you read the label and understand how they may affect pollinators would be critical as well.
Exactly, and that's where if you're going to use herbicides, it's selective application with selective herbicides. I mean, no broad spectrum, no spraying a wide swath, because hopefully you're going to manage it before it becomes a big area.
Okay, so I'm going to put together kind of two questions. One of them may have been a response from a participant to the previous question, but maybe this can you can comment on this. So the first part of it was almonds. What is your opinion on the honeybee population due to large export-import of honeybees to California for a very brief period? And then there was another response that mentioned the idea of that without the bees, you would see significant reduction in the almond crop. Almond growers need to practice integrated crop pollination. So do you want to maybe comment on both of those comments?
Right, and there is a lot of research going on out in California, because we have this issue that we've got a system that is not sustainable. The almond growers in California aren't finding enough hives, and so they're actually scrambling now to actually rediscover the native bees they have in the areas of these almond groves, and are providing habitats to encourage their presence on a year-round basis there. Our problem with honeybees and the varroa mite and small hive beetle and the variety of other issues with long-distance transportation are not going to be going away anytime soon.
Okay. Thank you for that, Doug. So another question, and you may have answered this after they asked the question, but if you just want to reiterate, what do you suggest for reducing impact of pesticides on pollinator population?
Well, my first thing would be is don't use it anywhere near where you have habitat. And so, or if you need to use it, like to get a noxious weed or an invasive type plant out, then once again, this idea of going in and maybe literally cutting the plant off and daubing its surface with a paintbrush in a dilute herbicide mixture, so that you are just strictly putting it where it needs to be only. This is what I'm talking about.
Okay. So another question, and it was a little bit of more of a comment mixed with the question, and it was referring to artificial lights at night interfering with plants' ability to produce seeds and for nocturnal pollinators to gather food.
Yeah, it
so
does.
Has anyone done a study on this in the U.S., or can you comment about that at all?
Well, I know that there is data showing that there is a problem in areas, particularly along lit interstates and things like this, where it has a tremendous effect on this photoperiodism, and it does affect the nocturnal type of insects as well because it's a constant daylight situation.
So in terms of management of that, there's probably not a lot that we can do.
There really isn't anything you can do because uh, yes, other than shade cloth. I mean, you're kind of talking about the idea that you're trying to keep sunlight out, and this might be where some type of a windbreak or tall growing border planting that would knock that light out would be very helpful.
Ah, good suggestion. Okay, so the next question, how do you control voles from affecting a large planting of transplants or emerging seedlings?
Yes, that's the $10,000 question. Um, First of all, if we have our farm set up where we have trees and open areas, our native we greatly over time will improve our raptor population, our predatory raptor population, and they love voles. They really do. And but there is a problem in the beginning that it takes a few years for the raptors to find your voles, and in that meantime, you're dealing with it. So when you're dealing with it, then our issue becomes the idea of putting up barriers that the voles can't get around or through. So like hardware cloth, burying it a few inches in the ground and then extending it up, 12 inches. Uh, for voles, that's an impediment for them that they can't get around. That works. We can also use hardware cloth around the base of plants.
And would the idea also be that with these mass plantings, you're maybe accounting for that by overplanting by a certain percentage and thinking that vole damage is going to occur, so let's plant more than we need to maybe help with that?
Yes, and whatever you do, low mow around this area. Keep this to be an open area so that because voles and small rodents hate to cross open areas because that's when they're most susceptible to predation. So this idea of if it's the grassy area, keep that grass, 2 inches or less, so that as I hate to say it, but it becomes a killing zone for predators, so that they can move in there and catch those voles.
Okay. So another question that came up when you were discussing the cover crop management and you were referring to cover crop termination before seed set, the question came in, why don't we want seed set in cover crops?
Ah, well, in my case, I use buckwheat a lot in that midsummer drought between my spring crop and because I'll then usually plant those areas to a fall seeding. I'll put my buckwheat in there. But if I allow the buckwheat to go to seed, guess what comes up with my fall greens? Buckwheat. And it comes up really, really thick. And so the idea is if we mow it off, or which is all you need to do is just mow it off. After it's done seeding, after it's done blooming, before we begin to see those hard seeds forming, and that's all you have to do is just go out and watch, and we begin to see those lower seeds beginning to go, uh-oh, it's time to mow it off, and then there's no problem. But this can be a real problem with grasses and some of the other things, our oats and rye and clovers and those types of things.
So the idea is that the cover crop could become a weed in your subsequent crop if you're not managing it at seed
Right.
set.
That's why I said it's the cover crop that keeps on giving.
Okay. So another question popped up relating to native bees nesting spot in the middle of my front yard. I was stung 5 times. It made
Yeah,
walking on my lawn to my native
yeah,
flowers impossible. And then that
yeah.
also sort of spun off a conversation that was related to these were probably yellow jackets, not honeybees. And then this someone mentioned, are yellow jackets also a type of pollinator? Do yellow
Yes.
jackets nest in the ground? So it was kind of
Yeah,
that it
yeah.
spurred off a little bit of a commentary. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think it goes back to the fact that 70% of our native bees nest in the ground. So we just have a whole bunch of bees that nest in the ground. Now then, that being said, is that what can we do? If this is in an area where it causes problems to you or your family, then you're going to have to deal with, unfortunately, you're going to have to probably have to deal with that nest of bees. Because if people are getting stung, this can be a problem. The other thing is that if this is a problem, and you could plant something, or you could, well, actually, you could not mow that area but then that can be a problem. So typically, when it's in our front yard or it's in a place where people are typically moving, then we may need to control those bees. If it's just an issue of being stung when you're mowing in that area, mow in the early morning or mow in the evening as we get, when the sun gets low in the sky, or when it falls behind trees or something like that. Bees guide off the sun. They'll be back and they'll be resting somewhere, and you can mow in that area and without any harm of being stung.
Okay, great. Someone else asked a question about yellow jackets being a type of pollinator. In the IM thread, it was answered that yes, but possibly not as good as native bees. Would you agree with that, or is there anything else you wanted to include about?
I know of no information, but yellow jackets are considered one of our most common native pollinators here in Illinois.
Okay. So the final question that I have is it better to have plants of the same type planted as a group, or should plantings be all mixed up with different types and scattered?
Uh, you can do it either way. Preferred would be a mix of plants planted, so that if one dies out, there's many more there. There's others that the pollinators can pick and choose from. But if that isn't possible or doesn't work well, particularly in a landscape planting, then the idea of planting this here and another somewhere else, but keeping them once again, if we can keep them especially within 100 yards or less of each other, then our native pollinators will adapt and it'll be fine.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Doug, for this fabulous presentation and sharing all of your expertise. I want to thank everyone for joining this webinar, and we'll go back and edit the presentation so it's seamless for the recording. But I hope you got some information out of this, and you can put something in place for this upcoming growing season. Look for an email from us for the archive webinar, as well as a short evaluation of this program. And with that, wish you a good rest of your day and a productive start to the 2018 season.